Welcome to the Safe and Safe Country podcast. We here speaking about people, decisions, and events which are important for safety and future of each of us. We speak about Ukrainian-Russian war, what to do with that, how to keep our country free, strong, and independent. I'm Alina Frolova, and this podcast is a joint project for the Center of Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. We all approach in the very important event for the whole world and for Ukraine especially, election in the United States. And United States as a key partner is always influencing the Ukraine, especially within this war. And we highly dependent from the policies which they adopting. That is why today I would like to speak about the United States, about the future elections, about how the world is seen from the United States and how Ukrainian war is seen from the United States. And my guest today is a former ambassador to Ukraine and vice president of the Russia and Europe Center at the United States Institute of Peace, William Taylor. Welcome.
Alina, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would like also to mention part of your biography because it's probably important for this conversation. You were not only charge d'affaires of U.S. Embassy in Kiev, you were not only the ambassador to Ukraine for quite a substantial period, but during Arab Spring, you oversaw U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. You served in Jerusalem as a U.S. government's representative to Middle East Quartet, and served in Kabul and Baghdad, and coordinated U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And you also had a military experience as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in U.S. Army in Vietnam and Germany. So looks like you have a perfect experience specifically for evaluating what is happening here. And this is actually my first question to you. We see now wars in Europe and in Middle East. The situation is going like a more and more diverse and more difficult. People very often discuss whether we are in Third World War already or we are in 1933, let's say, when we have a chance to change the situation. How it is seemed from United States, from the politics of United States, what's happening here? Evaluate.
The view from the United States is that this is not a prelude to World War III. The view from the United States is that Ukraine is defending itself from an aggression, an unprovoked aggression, attack, invasion from Russia. For 961 days, Ukraine has held off the Russians. We are very pleased that we've been able to support Ukraine and assist Ukraine in holding off the Russians for 961 days, because we see this not as World War III. We see this as Ukraine defending, sadly on Ukrainian soil, Europe, the rest of Europe, from this aggression from the Russians. The Russians have attacked Ukraine. The Russians have not yet attacked NATO or any NATO ally. This is a war of Russia against Ukraine, which we are supporting Ukraine in its fight. And President Biden has made it clear in the past month that our goal is for Ukraine to win. President Biden has said our goal is for Ukraine to prevail, to win. And that's important to us. It's obviously important to Ukraine. It's important for the rest of Europe. So this is why we are supporting Ukraine. It's not a broader world war. It is a defense of a nation's sovereignty, Ukraine's sovereignty, and independence. And that's what we want to maintain.
What we also discuss with our European colleagues, for example, that Europe need to shift from perception of the of focusing their policies on welfare to focusing their policies on basic defense, actually, because of this long period of the good economic growth after the Second World War, of stable peace, sustainable peace, many people started to think that this is possible forever. Yes, and what Europe is facing now and what is suffering now, that we need to change the mind from the absolutely safe democracy development with focus on social payments, on immigrants as the biggest problem of Europe, yes, to some very basic defense. And there is a feeling among some experts that the basic idea for Europeans now, like a promise everything, but give us a basic defense. And this is cause fears of that Ukrainian would be negotiated behind the scene. And this is something which is yet felt only in Europe. But do you see this change in global policy that, again, taking into consideration the Middle East, taking into consideration the Red Sea, which is now a very unstable region, are we moving to a unsafe world with focusing on basic defense, or we still have a chance for this good welfare, economic growth, and some kind of, in very short period, understandable world?
It's a great question. And you're right to point out that Europe benefited from a long period of time when nations adhered to rules and an order. Nations didn't invade each other. Nations respected each other's sovereignty, even when there were disagreements, even when there were small conflicts. I mean, we remember the Balkans. But in terms of great wars, great powers, since World War II, with the arrival of an order that the Soviet Union abided by and large, most of the world recognized this order was good for them. As you said, it led to prosperity, a measure of stability that allowed development. And that was all trashed. That was all ruined by the Russians when they invaded in 2014. And to reestablish that order, it's important that Ukraine win. Going back to what President Biden has said, it's important for Ukraine to win. Russia cannot be allowed to trash that world order. We have to try to get back to an order, a world that respects sovereignty of nations, respect borders of nations. And in order to do that, again, Ukraine must prevail. There are other problems in the world. You've talked about what's going on in the Middle East. That's a potential tragedy. It doesn't have to be. There's a way to manage that. There's a way to, there's a possibility that doesn't lead to a wider war. There are solutions that people have talked about, which are in the interest of all the parties in that region. So that's a possibility too. But I see those conflicts, and there are several conflicts in the Middle East, all having to do with Israel. But those conflicts don't have to flare up into problems for the rest of the world, for Europe. We do have to, I think we have to focus on Ukraine winning the war against the Russians to reestablish this order that you rightly point out led to prosperity and some stability since World War II.
Okay, let's speak about U.S. Yes, every person in Ukraine now following the elections in very tight manner. It seems like U.S. anyway will be focused more on internal issues, whoever will come, whatever administration will come, because we've been following debates and we saw how many internal problems were discussed, which is naturally, but not for U.S., because U.S. was always some kind of one of the leading countries, and there were a lot of about the international politics, but this time it was a minor attention to that. Knowing from inside both teams, I'm absolutely sure that you know both teams, because the U.S. policy is not like Ukraine, that each cycle you see a lot of new people. There are some kind of heritage there in U.S. policy. What do you think would be the decision-making of any of those both teams? What would be the focused area? And of course, how you can project their attitude to Ukraine and Russian war and their ability to act fast?
We know more about Kamala Harris's attitude towards Ukraine and the Russian war than we know about Donald Trump's attitude. We know because as vice president, Kamala Harris has fully supported the strong position of the Biden-Harris administration in support of Ukraine. She's a strong supporter of the coalition that President Biden has assembled, that President Biden wanted to come lead a big summit over the past weekend, but was prohibited by an act of God, a big hurricane. So he didn't come. I hope that's just postponed. I'm hoping that will be rescheduled. But Vice President Harris is fully supportive of that, and maybe even more supportive. Maybe it is possible, as you say, it will depend a lot on the kind of people that she brings in to administration. If she were to win, she might be willing to take an even stronger position on some decisions that the U.S. government has to make. Maybe some of these decisions won't take as long as they have taken in the past. We know less about former President Trump's position. What we do know is that he met former President Trump with President Zelensky, and they apparently had a good conversation. We also know that this latest assistance package of $61 billion that passed our Congress last spring in an overwhelming bipartisan basis was only allowed to come to the floor of the House of Representatives because the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, went down and had a conversation with former President Trump down in Florida. And former President Trump tacitly approved the Speaker bringing that bill to the floor. That's to say that there's some indication that he understands the importance of U.S. providing support for Ukraine, and he allowed that to go forward. Now, what we also know is his choice for vice president, J.D. Vance, has made some strange statements about doesn't really care what happens in Ukraine. That's troubling. But we also know that former President Trump makes his own decisions. And so the last thing we know, Alina, on this question is that the American people, when asked, support Ukraine, 60%, and support continued assistance to Ukraine. And so whoever is in the White House in January, whoever wins the election in November, will know and will represent the American people and their support for Ukraine. You're also right that foreign policy hasn't yet played a major role in this election. My observation, though, is that it doesn't usually. It's not. Normally, like in Ukraine, like in a lot of countries, economics are just a big part of it. The state of the economy, grocery prices and gasoline prices are a bigger factor than foreign policy. But you're also right that for a long time in the United States, there's been a basic agreement on the role of the United States in the world. And the role of the United States in the world as a force for good, for order, for stability, for economic growth, opposition to violations of those principles we talked about in terms of sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. By and large, that has been constant and an agreement among administrations one after the other, a strong role for the United States. It has not been a major issue in elections, and maybe that's okay, because if they do represent, if whoever is in the White House does, if whoever that person is in January reflects the views of the American people, which our democracy is designed to do, then we will continue to support Ukraine.
Yeah, but we just get acquainted to the situation when United States is United States in the position of the leader of the world. But actually, yes, if we look back, this position started to appear after the Second World War, and before that world somehow existed. And I think that, yes, it would, of course, it doesn't mean that United States will be weak, but probably the role will be different. And do you think that Europe will play a more substantial role in the world, or they also will be focused more on their internal issue and defense?
I think both. I think they will be focused, just like Americans, just like Ukrainians, will focus on their own economy and their own welfare and their own internal politics. But they will also, and we already see this, the Europeans starting to step up really in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When you look at the total amount of assistance to Ukraine from Europe and the total amount of assistance to Ukraine from the United States, the Europeans are larger, have provided more economic and military. When you add them both together, the Europeans have provided more overall than the United States. The United States, of course, has provided more weapons and more ammunition, and the Europeans have provided more financial support, economic support. But they have stepped up. Will that last? That's the right question. If the Europeans see that the United States is stepping back for some reason, changing its attitude towards leadership in alliances, in particular NATO, the Europeans may well step up. There's an indication already of a kind of a European pillar in NATO. And that's healthy. That's okay to have a European pillar and an American pillar in NATO. It can be a strength. It can be a benefit for NATO. And if there is the strengthening of that European pillar in NATO, that gives the Europeans the ability to provide continued support to Ukraine.
Speaking about NATO, yes, there are a lot of last week's rumors about the possibility suddenly to invite Ukraine to NATO. Everyone is speaking about that, like experts, politicians, media, everyone. So if everyone speaks, something is happening, obviously. And one of the theories, let's say, that we will have this gap between the actual election and new president coming to the White House, where President Biden will be more free to make some decisions and to use it for maximum delivering the assistance. Did you hear some rumors?
I've sensed the same things that you just described. That is, there is an interest in NATO. There's an interest in NATO here in Ukraine. There is an interest in Ukraine joining NATO in Europe. There's an interest in Ukraine joining NATO in the United States as well.
But the United States actually was blocking together with
The United States
Germany.
and Germany have up until now hesitated to take a decisive step. However, Elena, you will remember that in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, it was the United States, it was President Bush who pushed very, very hard for Ukraine to join NATO. He failed at that time, but we learned some lessons there. And the lessons we learned, if we decide, as you say, if President Biden decides that he wants to try to get an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, if he really pushes hard and starts early enough, that it is possible. That is possible. Now, you asked the right question. Now that President Biden has decided he's not going to run for president, for the last month, he has actually taken some steps that can be interpreted. He's taken some steps that indicate that he is going to be a little bolder on his leadership, on his attitude towards Ukraine. He has now changed what he says is the U.S. goal. The U.S. goal is for Ukraine to win, to prevail. That's what he has said is our goal. And he has increased the flow of weapons, and there are more and more announcements. I expect another big announcement soon, in the next couple of days, of more weapons to come from the United States to Ukraine. He had intended, again, we were talking about this, he had intended to lead this international coalition at Ramstein. That was his decision. That was President Biden's decision to do that. All those things suggest to me that he is doing what you suggested, Lena. That is that he recognizes that he can now have a big effect. That he can leave a lasting mark on this history, and he can lead it in. We'll see. We'll see if that comes about. But you're right. There is interest now in Ukraine joining NATO. And I think it's possible. It's going to take a lot of work. Get a lot of work on NATO side to get that consensus. It takes all those NATO nations, 32 NATO nations, to agree. But it's also going to take work on Ukraine's side. Ukraine's got some work to do on getting ready to join the alliance.
So you think that if there would be an invitation, it still will take quite some time to join, even if we take out the issue of the war?
Yes, I think that take out the issue of the war because the actual joining, Ukraine actually joining NATO, cannot happen while there's the actual war, while the war is going on.
But what about that, like a concept of giving the fifth article protection to the territory which is not on the front line and not occupied?
So I have heard Ukrainians talking about that, that option. And that's where it has to come from. That idea has to come from Ukrainians. That cannot come from Americans or any other NATO ally. That decision on how to join the alliance and what, as you say, what area Article 5 of the treaty is covered, that cannot be made by any foreigner. That has to be made by Ukrainians. But I think it's also true that however this war ends, let's say, I mean, you've already had a hypothetical, but let's say that the Ukrainians push all the Russians out of Ukraine over the next 6 months, militarily. General Syrskyi figures out a way, and enough soldiers are recruited. The Americans step up, and the Europeans step up with their support, military support, and Ukraine pushes the Russians out of its country. Even then, Ukraine needs to join NATO.
Yes, sure. More than ever, I would say.
More than ever, or else the Russians will be back. Or President Zelensky has said that another way the war may end is partially by military means, partially by General Syrskyi pushing back on the Russians, but also partially by, President Zelensky has said, partially by having conversations, having diplomacy. And that would probably take a little more time. But that's another way the war could end. But in that case, too, Ukraine needs to be in NATO. So in either way the war ends, Ukraine needs to be in NATO. And I think that's important for people to understand.
And the war ends. You are now in expert community. You have the very lovely institute where you're working, and it's called Institute of Peace. So probably you have a very good analysis of how this war may end up. Do you have scenarios? Did you plan something inside? Again, as a player of mind in expert community, and how you see the situation for the future?
So I see the situation somewhat, as I just mentioned, of a couple of different scenarios, a couple of different possibilities. And the important decisions about how this war ends, the important decisions have to be made by Ukrainians. The Americans or NATO are not going to devise the military strategy or even an overall diplomatic strategy. This has to be done, and I think is being done by Ukrainians. We take seriously this peace plan. We take seriously this victory plan. We take seriously Ukrainians' concentration on how, exactly your question, how this war ends, how they succeed in taking back their territory, all the territory, from the Russians. And that may happen militarily. It may happen diplomatically. President Zelensky, as I say, has talked about both that happening. So in our view, what has to happen, and this is not a view of the United States Institute of Peace, because the Institute of Peace doesn't take positions on these kind of things. But in my view, Ukraine can well push back the Russians, and the United States and other NATO allies can indeed give Ukraine an invitation to join NATO when the war stops, and the Western coalition can continue to push on sanctions, continue to constrain the Russian economy, and the international community can continue to push and put pressure on the Russians to stop this war. And the combination of that economic, political, and military pressure, including an invitation to NATO when the war stops, can lead to the conclusion. The Russians could come to the conclusion based on that the Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. The Europeans are going to continue to support, and the Americans are going to continue to support Ukraine. And NATO has invited Ukraine to join. The Russians will have to, the Kremlin, Putin, will have to conclude that he can't win this war. And then he has to look for a way. He has to look for some way to get out of this. And if he comes to Ukraine and seeks negotiations based on the conclusion that he can't win this war, then it's up to the Ukrainians to decide how to respond.
Do you really believe that Putin can go to negotiations? I think that his legitimacy is based on this war. For him, it's easier to waste 4 more millions of Russians on the battlefield than to come to negotiations.
You're probably right, Lena. You're probably right. No one knows. I certainly don't know what's in his head. There are limits to how much he can waste of the Russian people, the Russian soldiers. There are limits to his ability to provide those weapons and ammunition to that war machine. Yes, he is getting artillery ammunition from the North Koreans. Yes, he is getting drones and other missiles from the Iranians. But there are limits to how much he can do over time. He's going to have his own set of problems, and it's up to the Americans, to the Europeans, to support the Ukrainians, to demonstrate to Mr. Putin that he's not going to win, that he's got to look for another way out.
It leads me to the question that many times we discussed also with you, that one of the preconditions of this war was the wrong evaluation of Russia or wrong perception of Russia by Europeans and Americans. That you've been believing that some kind of relations, trade relations, economic relations, exchange of students, cultural exchange, will tie it up and minimize the risk of Russia going back to dictatorship, which didn't happen. Then it was a mistake of evaluating the capabilities of Russia, exaggerating them. Probably this is now a mistake of the capability of nuclear capabilities of Russia again, because we're all speaking about this like a factor of Russian threats. Did America change their perception of Russia?
Yes.
Did you make some kind of lessons learned?
Yes.
How you see Russia now?
You're exactly right. Several U.S. presidents in the past have thought when they came into office, they could deal with the Russians one way or the other, whether it was reset or whether it was looking into the...
Park the Russian problem. This is the Sullivan words.
Park the Russia problem. Exactly. Several presidents, and not just President Biden, but President Bush and President Obama, President Trump, all thought that they could deal with the Russians one way or the other. I think the answer to your question is yes, we have concluded that that was a mistake. We have now seen what they do. We've now seen that the Russians invade their neighbors. They trash these principles that guided relations among states since World War II, as we talked about earlier. And they don't abide by the agreements that they enter into. So we have concluded that until something major changes in Russia, we will not enter into agreements. We will not do those exchanges you talked about. We will not enter into economic relations with the Russians because they have demonstrated that they cannot be dealt. They cannot be counted on to agree or to follow up on agreements that they make, whether it's economic agreements or political agreements or social agreements. We've seen how they treat that. You've mentioned how Putin treats his own soldiers. He's willing to sacrifice incredible numbers of soldiers. That indicates what he's capable of doing and willing to do to neighbors or other nations. We have concluded that you can't do business with that kind of a dictator.
Well, but this is not only about Putin. Historically, they behaved like that. And probably the Putin is just the projection of the will of nation.
For 300 years, Ukrainians have dealt with this problem of being a neighbor of Russia, whether it was the Tsars or whether it was in the Soviets or whether it's the Russian Federation. You're exactly right. There has been this constant in history of the Russians trying to oppress, trying to dominate Ukraine. And so, and it's not just Ukraine, but Ukraine has borne the major brunt of this. But, the Poles know the Russians, the Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanians, the Finns know this. So we Americans have learned from you and other East Europeans who have lived next to the Russians, how we should understand the Russians. I think we have finally learned. You're right. We've made mistakes before, and I think we have now recognized those mistakes.
Thank you for that. And one thing I would like to ask about, yesterday your institute made a closed presentation of the research you made and a policy paper, yes, which was like a focusing on future security configuration of Ukraine. And there were many questions we discussed, but there was one phrase of your colleague which just like a little bit stuck in my mind. He said that there is a threat that Ukraine is now in the period of obtaining new oligarchy. And this is something which obviously Ukrainians see. I'm absolutely sure that Americans and our Europeans are seeing that. And at the same time, we're speaking about that we're still fighting, we're still resilient, we still have this democracy as much as we can within this situation. And we don't want this like a wrong behavior of people who are now in power, broke up some relations with our partners. But your advices from you've been on many positions in different countries with different developments, and of course they're all different. But your advice, what else we can do not to go to this round again of the oligarchs, of the everything which actually we have since Kuchma times?
We have done a study. The Institute of Peace has looked at these issues, and in particular looked at the security sector of Ukraine. Following the war, it'll be a difficult time for Ukraine. It's a horrible time right now during the war. It'll be also a difficult time after the war when there'll be a demobilization of some kind. There will be challenges economically. There will be challenges of veterans coming back, reintegrating into families, into communities, into the economy. There'll be stresses and strains on that. And there will be dangers. There'll be concerns. There'll be vulnerabilities. And we looked at many of these challenges and have highlighted some ways that the United States and other supporters of Ukraine can help in that stage. After the war, for the benefit of the security sector, strengthening and winning the peace. And you're right, one of the concerns is that in this difficult time after the war, oligarchs could attempt to reassert themselves. We observed, and I think my colleague mentioned, that our observation is that the oligarchs seem to have lost a lot of influence during the war.
We have a lot of new scandals demonstrating the rising of new oligarchs.
There are scandals everywhere. No, in my country too. Let's be clear. But you ask about the kinds of actions that are necessary that that the Americans and the Europeans need to support, and that is an adherence to the values that you're fighting for. The values that you're fighting for on the rule of law, on transparency, on democratic governance. Democratic governance requires their ability to take in a lot of voices, Many voices are important for democracy, important for the rule of law to be able to ensure that no one can take over big sectors of the economy. No one can exert undue influence like in the past oligarchs have. So that adherence and fidelity to the values that you're fighting for, both on the democratic side and also the governance side, reform, the anti-corruption side, the anti-oligarch side, will be important, in particular important after the war and during this time. And the security sector will play a big role in that.
I think it's a good end for conversation. And I would like to thank you one more time for supporting Ukraine, because everyone who've been attached to politics in this country knows your personal perception, and you are a big friend of Ukraine, and I thank you for that. And I hope that United States will pass a turbulent time with the braveness and will come to the solution which your society and your people want to have. I still believe that U.S. will continue to be strong. Whatever elections happen, I don't think that the threat of democracy can come from United States. I hope so. So good luck with that elections.
Alina, thank you. We will need that luck. We need all your good wishes. I am proud. Americans are proud to be friends of Ukraine. And we strongly support. We need you to win. And we will do everything to help that.
Good words. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena.
It was Safe and Safe Country podcast, and I'm its host, Alina Frolova. The podcast itself is a joint project of the Center for Defense Strategy, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. And you can find us on resources of Ukrainska Pravda, as well as on the largest podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. Don't forget to subscribe and receive updates and join new episodes. Safe and Safe Country. It depends on each of us how soon the prefix "an" will disappear. Thank you.